Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to this first episode in our new series, Call My Supervisor, the PhD podcast for the School of Politics and Economics at King's College London. In each episode, we will be speaking to a doctoral candidate from one of our departments to pick their brains about all things PhD, from their research and ideas to their revelations and advice. We hope to offer a platform for those studying with us to showcase their work while offering invaluable insight into what life is like studying to become a doctor. If nothing else, we hope you finish up today having learned something you didn't know when you started it. My name is Daniel Mansfield, and I am the Communications Officer for the School of Politics and Economics here at King's College. And I'm pleased to introduce you to my co-host for this episode, Tomek Gola, a final year undergraduate studying European politics at King's. Tomek, hi.
Hello, everyone.
And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our very first guest, Bill Weston, a doctoral candidate studying with the Department of European and International Studies. Hi, Bill.
Hello.
Good stuff. So without further ado, let's make a start. Bill, can you just introduce your research, maybe the title and a very quick overview?
Okay, so I do research that crosses the different boundaries between economics and politics principally. So I look at why certain economies are more innovative than other economies. So essentially, I look at the last 20 years or so and I say, so with innovation, the thing that has changed is that it used to be that the principal source of innovation was Western Europe. It was America, it was Canada, it was Australia, those kind of countries. During the last 50 years or so, but especially the last 20, that has changed. If you look at where a lot of the key developments are happening in tech, in, for example, artificial intelligence, if you look at the most complex manufacturing, like, for example, semiconductors, you can see that a whole bunch of that is now in Japan, it's in South Korea, it's in Taiwan, it's in China. And I say, why is it that it was East Asia that happened in and not, say, Eastern Europe? When the Second World War finishes, it's fairly simple. It's Western Europe, North America. These are the principal areas where the key economic activity happens, where the new innovations come from. And then after that, you have Eastern Europe slightly further behind them in development, in a development sense. Why was it not that Eastern Europe took that place? And so I essentially look at that, and rather than a lot of researchers who look at it in quite ideological terms, they sort of say it's about markets. We need to free the markets and make sure that there's so much competition that innovation will just happen. And then on the left, people will more likely say, well, no, it's about like using the government and spending with the government coffers to try and make things happen. What I look at is the stuff in the middle of that, which is the institutions that these all come from. So I essentially argue that certain styles of institution are actually more important in bringing about innovation. And there are still things like micro causes. So, for example, as an individual innovator, you might be influenced by things like psychology. Maybe it's about education. All of that is the case. But I look at the structural influence. So why is it that a country like Japan is really innovative? It's about the way in which there's an effective power distribution, whereas, say, in a country like Guatemala, you don't see that because there is much more of a concentration of powers in certain families that can influence things a lot more. So it's about a mixture between different entities, so especially institutions in labor, institutions in capital, which mean that innovation is much more incentivized, where you don't have a power vacuum, but then you don't have a massive competition for power. And my working title is "We possess all things, and we have no use for your countries manufactures. It's a quote from a Chinese emperor in the 18th century, when one of the first interactions between the British Empire and the Chinese Empire occurred. And it's sort of it's a symbol of the way in which economic activity and its centers change over time. And yeah, I essentially look at that.
Has the title changed since you first set out on this? Has it shifted? Has your theme shifted?
So when you do academic research, part of it is that you want to draw the reader in, because as much as it's about it's a scholarly pursuit, right? You have an idea, you want to see whether it's true or not. You see whether that has an influence in the thing that you're studying. But at the same time, there's the pursuit of the academia, and then there's the pursuit to market it as much like a book or a film or something. So what you do with an academic project is that you always want to have sort of two titles. So you have an academic technical title, and then you have a much more eye-catching title, which is always a challenge, where there's a tension between drawing in the reader and also being able to make sure that that title aptly sort of summarizes what you're looking at. So that title has changed quite a lot, and I'll probably change it a lot between now and then.
This sounds really interesting and very relevant in the current economic climate. I was wondering if you could also share some more detail on the economies you'd be studying and what exactly you'll be looking at in your research.
The whole process is comparing the different trends and patterns that we see in these two areas, so East Asia and Eastern Europe. So from one perspective, I look at all the countries in the region a little bit. So for example, part of it is just gathering the data to show the trends throughout the whole region. But that's like fairly simple. I can sort of get that data together, and I can like do different techniques to show the trends and show where my idea is right, where it's maybe not, and then I sort of like interpret the data as it goes. But in terms of more depth, I think most likely I'm going to go into a lot more depth when it comes to Hungary and the Czech Republic on the Eastern European side, and I think most likely South Korea and Japan on the East Asian side. Part of the thing with doing academic research is, as with all exploits, it's kind of like you start out with this image in your head, which is, if I was going to prove this thing and I had infinite resources and everything is possible, what evidence would I have? That approach will never happen, because you're never going to have the resources to do that, but also sometimes data just doesn't exist. Sometimes information can't really be gleaned. Sometimes people, for example, with interviewing or surveying, sometimes people don't know the reasons why they do the things they do. So you're never going to get the kind of information that you want. But then you can work from that and say, what is possible? And then essentially you can sort of say, well, I have these resources, like I can use this, say, connection that I know with this person, they can help me find that kind of thing, where it's kind of like piecing stuff together. And that's the idea. So with those cases, I'm going to try and go into more detail. And if I have the right resources, then I'll be able to do some little surveying of certain people, where they'll be able to tell me a lot more about, say, during that period of time, what was the corporate culture in this specific company? What was the atmosphere like in this specific department in the civil service, which gives you a lot more of the idea of the system that it's going into, essentially. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sounds very interesting with how you want to connect that sort of data that is available for collection with interviews and methods that you will be carrying out yourself. To me, it's also really interesting to listen as someone who is considering an academic career, to see how much work it also takes for you to have figured that out already in the proposal stage, which I'm hoping to hear more about in our second part of the podcast.
And Bill, you've got sort of, you've got technology, you've got nation states, you've got trade, you've got innovation, all sort of running through the work you're doing here. I suppose my question is, why this subject? What about these areas interests you?
I think that when you imagine, say, someone starting a PhD, you imagine that there was a moment where they were like, I'll do that. But it doesn't really happen like that. So, for example, Tomek, you're finishing your undergrad, right? So you go through your academic career. I don't just mean at university, but everything you've studied, and little things come together. Say you really liked doing a little SO on one thing. Say that you really liked one academics class. Over time, they all sort of snowball together. And if you keep going down the path of academia, slowly you specialize more and more and more. And eventually, if you decide that you want to go down the route of staying in academia, or at least doing a PhD, the best way of doing it, and in all truth, doing in such a way that it's going to keep your attention, is that as far as possible, my attitude is you group together the things that you most enjoy and you see whether they can come together. So, for example, I really like looking at the way in which different policies and different government actions come together through different interests. The way in which there are certain access points where people can influence policy, and all of the different agents in that decision. So, say, civil servants, the actual individual MPs who are voting on a measure, the companies that have interest in something, say the unions who have an interest in something, the way in which they come together to have an outcome, which you wouldn't necessarily understand unless you saw each of the individual agents within the system and the way in which they were perceiving that. But also, I really like looking at something like innovation, which people don't really understand. Part of it is also the more nitty-gritty stuff that attracts you to it. Like, say, for example, I find it quite tiresome looking at certain policy debates where it's essentially just a question of, well, I have a preference for this style of ideology, so I think that something should work out this way, and we're going to continue this debate, and I'm going to come up with more evidence over time, you're going to come up with more evidence over time, and nothing really changes. I'm not very interested in those kind of ideological debates, and that's part of why I went for something like this, where it's not really in the traditional left-right sort of authoritarian, libertarian question. It's much more about the way in which different interests come together to form different types of institutions, if you know what I mean.
It's interesting to hear how being as someone who's sort of at the end of the first stage on this academic path, maybe I've had some imagination of how this all comes together, but from what you're saying, it's all it's different pieces that you kind of piece out together from your different experiences.
Yeah, also part of it is it's sort of partly about just what you're good at as well. It's just sort of piecing together stuff that you're good at. Because, for example, I'm not 100% on what I want to do after PhD. I think most likely I would quite like to stay in academia, at least for a certain period of time. But if you fill your thesis with lots of methodologies that you can showcase, for example, I've put this in my thesis, you can read this is me doing this is my evidence that I'm good at, say, textual analysis, or say matching methods, quantitative approach. It's sort of like this vast portfolio that you can collate together to sort of say, there's me showing this in this big thesis, but also implicitly throughout the whole project, I'm making this portfolio to show, look, I can do all these things.
I was wondering how far along are you in your research, and how long you think it will take to complete?
That is a good question. I think it's a difficult one to answer. So I think when you imagine it as there's this book that you're writing. How many pages have you written? But I think the difficulty is it's kind of like, yes, you're writing this book, but you're also constructing this really, really long sort of like logical ladder. And the difficult thing is making the logical ladder, which is we start with this question. This is me going through different answers to this question. And then under all of these different answers, this is me saying, so this is what my answer is under all of that. So I think in terms of making that, a lot of the bare bones of what I'm going to say, I'd say maybe 20, maybe more like 30%. I've done that. But in terms of what I've written, I think I've written 13,000 words of that. And your thesis can technically be any length, really. Like the standard thing is it's 100,000 words. But for the most part, what happens as you progress in academia is that there are fewer and fewer specific rules for things to give the academics in the department more leeway to decide stuff. So, for example, the only regulation really is it has to be under 100,000 words, such that there's two stages. If you say, I reckon I'm done with my PhD, you first go to your supervisor, and your supervisor has to agree with you. And so a lot of that is up to the discretion of the supervisor. And then if the supervisor says, yeah, I think you're done as well, then that's when it goes to an examination board, and then you have to pass a viva. And that's when you decide whether this is a PhD or not, because it's not like, say, an undergrad where it's you do all of these examinations, this is your mark, this is your grade. That's what happens. It's just either you have a PhD or you don't.
Okay, so Bill, thinking about your work so far, I know some people do field work, some people do interviews, some people trawl through databases. What sort of sources, data, references are you using? Where do you get them from? Where do you even start to think about where you get them from?
So I do mixed methods. So from one perspective, I'm keen to try using things like survey and things like interviews. My supervisor, Soo-Hyun Lee, is very well known for being especially good at elite interviewing. So rather than say surveying thousands people who have been in touch with, say, a certain phenomenon, let's say inflation, if we were studying inflation in the UK right now, some people would look at thousands of people's perspectives, but it would be within a very constrained system. So you would say have a survey of any length, but it would be, say, have you experienced your household spending more on basic household necessities? And it would be, say, yes, no, that kind of thing. You're not going to get as much information from lots of people because you're surveying lots and lots of people at the same time. But with interviewing, it's more about picking very specific people who you think will give you really interesting testimony on a phenomenon. So instead of, say, surveying 1,000 people about inflation, you would interview, say, 3 people who can tell you the most about it. And that wouldn't be necessarily just, say, the head of the International Monetary Fund, who would tell you a lot of things, or the chairman of the Bank of England, or something like that. You could also say, we want to interview an expert on this thing, and we're studying families' responses to inflation. And what makes a person an expert in that is much more about primary experience of the phenomenon. So you might very well interview specific families and ask them lots and lots of questions about their personal experience, because that is a type of expertise as well. It's not just about knowing lots about how inflation happens or why it happens, that kind of thing. It's about being an expert in real experience of a real phenomenon, if you get what I mean. But then I'm less experienced in surveying and interviewing, but I'm very keen to do that, depending on the extent to which I can get the resources to do very much of that. But I also do quite a big quantitative approach, which will be, say, thinking about how do you measure the thing that I'm trying to measure, and then bringing in as much data as possible and using different statistical techniques to plot the relationships between the things that I'm studying. But one of the things that I am finding with my thesis is that there aren't easy measurements, if you see what I mean. So if you looked at, say, inflation, that's quite an easy thing to measure. It sort of measures itself. It's just the price level for something is going up compared to how it was, but you're still getting the same product. It's just that the price is going up. So you look at the change in the price, assuming that the thing that you're measuring, the product, is staying the same. Whereas with something like innovation is more of an idea than it is a thing in and of itself. So if you imagine, say a new way of preparing a certain food or something like that, that's a type of innovation. That is someone inventing a new thing which changes economic activity. Let's say it makes preparing something 20% quicker. How do you show that happening across like a whole country? So a lot of the time, fairly basic measurements of that would be, say, how many, say, patents or industrial designs or trademarks are happening in each year. And that has value for sure, but that's only measuring it in specific circumstances. And then you have certain problems like, are we looking at the same thing? So for example, the UK has fairly strict patents and it has fairly long patents, where, for example, in China, the patent regulations are relatively lax in comparison. So it's one of those things where you have to sort of mix lots of different approaches academically, because it's not a thing that you can measure so easily.
Since you're already quite far into your research, has anything particularly surprised you about what you've been finding?
Yes, definitely. I think what surprised me, especially about the procedure of doing the research, is that in a lot of ways, doing that kind of research is really not that different from doing a regular job. And as much as though you'd imagine that, say, a person might spend a lot of their time doing very active things with their mind and sort of like looking at different ideas and trying to unpick them, or like, say, doing lots of data analysis and stuff. The reality is that with pretty much every job, a lot of it it's admin. A whole lot of it is doing lots of different things that are going to give you the information to think about. But so much of the time, I'm actually spending a good amount of it trying out different, say, data code. And a lot of the time it's not working and I've got to try something else. Or I'm just Googling to try and find very specific pieces of information. Or I'm emailing people because they might be able to help me if they chose to. So for example, during my master's thesis, I emailed around about 1,000 people asking for very specific types of data or information. And about 10 or so got back to me, because as much as it's a kind of system wherein you've got to be very proactive and you've got to try and find the thing that you're looking for, so much of the time, either it's not available or people don't get back to you because other people who have the kind of information that you could do with have other stuff that they need to be doing and don't necessarily have any reason to help you. It's also a lot of the time it's other things that aren't really like what you'd imagine would be what research is. Like a lot of the time I'm, say, just going through really, really big Word documents and just organizing the thoughts in them and sort of deciding that idea that I had, where does it go? Does any of the evidence exist for this? It's one of those things wherein, as with a lot of jobs, it's kind of like so much of the work isn't doing the thing itself. It's just preparing all of the stuff that you need along the way to actually be able to do it. So, for example, the actual writing of the thesis will probably constitute at most, say, 15-20% of the time, because there's so much other stuff along the way that takes so much time. And as with a lot of jobs, if you can't find ways of making that stuff quicker, everything takes so much longer.
Bill, 10 responses in 1,000 emails. Is that soul destroying, or do you cherish everyone that comes in? Is it like a lottery win when someone replies?
I think it's one of those things where you can choose to feel positive about something, and you've got to in that kind of situation. So, for example, I said about how I've sent so many emails to people asking for, say, information or something like that. And yeah, you're right. Like the response rate is a soul-destroyingly small number, but any single one of those emails could completely change my project. So you could very easily sort of think, if 1% of people that you email actually do anything about it, how do you send any more emails? But eventually, eventually, it's all worth it. Because, for example, I emailed someone who came up with this fantastic new approach of measuring how powerful unions are in certain countries, which I thought was brilliant. Where, for example, if you want to imagine, say, how powerful a union is in a country, you might think, well, how many people are in the union? But that's not such a perfect measure. A lot of people are in unions for lots of different reasons. Like, for example, when I was an undergraduate, I was a member of the National Union of Students. At the time, I didn't really know much about what they did, but I knew that it got me discounts, so I joined. Or, for example, if you want to be a doctor, like a medical doctor, you have to be a member of the British Medical Association. That doesn't necessarily mean the union is really powerful and influential in what happens in the economy or what the government does. So this woman, Anne Metten in Germany, came up with this really, really amazing index. And I saw it and I emailed her and I was like, this is really amazing. Can you please explain how you did this? And can I please see your data? Just emailed me back 2 days later with the entire data set that she'd made, which completely changed the way in which my thesis was going to work, where it could have turned out that I tried to come up with a completely new measurement for that on my own, or I just had to split the difference and say, in the interest of time, I'm just going to have to use more simple measures. But because I emailed her, she emailed me back with that data that she didn't have to give me. I can now use that, and that completely changes the way in which the thesis works, and it gives such a better measurement of the thing, which eventually is going to mean that the evidence that I'm using and the evidence that my argument rests on is just vastly better. So it's like, at the same time as every individual email that you send to people, so much of the time, nothing will happen. Eventually, people will help you. And if you focus on the people who do want to help you, that's what gets you through.
We've spoken, I think, about how at times your title has the title of the work has changed, and how something like an email being sent to you can change the direction or perhaps the gist of your own work. So I wonder then if in an ideal world you have an end goal for your research or an ideal outcome or something you hope it will show or prove, or whether you're just sort of working towards a goal and seeing where it takes you.
When you say an outcome in mind, do you mean in terms of what that means for me and my career or my research, or what that means for like my field of study?
What I mean is the outcome of the research itself. So if I wanted to set out, if the basis of my thesis were Arsenal are the most successful football team of the last decade, and my ideal outcome is, yes, Arsenal are the most successful team of the last decade, that's my ideal outcome. Do you see what I mean?
Well, I mainly work in non-fiction, but I can understand fiction writing in theory. So it's kind of like on one level for just research in the field, I essentially, each time I write a new project, it's about what is everyone saying in this field? What are they assuming? What are they not able to agree about? and what contribution can I make? So it's kind of like one of the things that comes up in academic meetings quite a lot is, so what? At the end of the day, if you're doing a research project, there has to be a point. And I think the point here is essentially advancing the study and showing where the literature beforehand was lacking, where it was right, where it was wrong, what new information can we bring into it, and how can we interpret that new information. So it's about essentially challenging some of those and making new contributions. So for example, in innovation literature, they don't use very broad metrics in that, because a lot of the time they're quite difficult to find. So one of the things that I'm keen to do is to set more of a precedent for using lots of new data to try and measure that, to give like a broader view. And it might well turn out that I gather much more data and I try and give this much broader view, but the trends are still the same. It could be that comes out, and the value is that I can try and advance that study and bring in much more information and show like much broader context of the different trends. But it could be that all of that information still tells the same story, if you see what I mean. It could be that, but part of the point is to actually use that information and see what happens. And then part of it as well is say, try and show in the literature that a lot of the assumptions that they're making don't rest on very much. So for example, especially as you go further and further back with new technology and new systems of getting data and information, mean that the further you go back, the less information research rests on. So we still base a lot of our assumptions about how certain things work on what today would be considered quite shaky data. So part of it is as well bringing in new information and looking back at a lot of the assumptions and saying, for example, it's assumed in my literature that liberal market economies, like for example the United States, like the United Kingdom, that come up with the most radical innovations. And if you actually look now, that isn't really the case. And a lot of the assumptions that spring from that sort of fall when you see that that's not the case. So a lot of the newest innovations do come from the United States, not as much the UK now, but then increasingly it's countries like Japan, like South Korea. And so a lot of that new information completely changes the assumptions that you make. And then it's just new ideas as you go along, just challenging what's there. That's kind of the idea.
Yeah, I think it sounds, especially in a field that is so dynamic as economic development and innovation, that data quickly might become outdated. And so that obviously justifies doing research in that field. I was wondering also, did you have any sort of, I bet you had some assumptions when you started doing your research, and what kind of assumptions were they, and have these changed since the beginning?
I assumed that for the most part that innovation was going to come from, say, competitive markets. That's not the case. It sometimes does, it sometimes doesn't. It follows different trends. Then, for example, I assumed that the best answer to my question was all about having certain institutions being as strong as possible, whereas that's not really the case. If you have very weak institutions, then outside forces are able to influence them, especially, for example, like multinational corporations are able to influence policy and make it the most friendly towards them. But if you look at the countries with the strongest institutions, they actually also have their own problems. Then there's so many assumptions that you sort of go through in your research, and it's sort of, I go through this process, which is essentially just following each of my points as they go along. And then I think I said earlier, you construct this ladder, this logic ladder, which is essentially, you have a sentence which is, this is what I'm trying to say. And then I think that the best way you can make your argument throughout your whole thesis, the best, is You break down every single thing that you're trying to say, and then you try and chip away at it as much as possible. It's like a rolling road machine. You try and trial out all of the different ideas that you're trying to prove, and then you try and expose it to the most possible stress to see if it stays. So you're constantly sort of battling with different assumptions as you go. The interesting thing when you think about, say, like just basic stuff like what does doing an innovation mean? It's like you're constantly finding that you're assuming things with that. Like, for example, if you're going to measure innovation, you're going to have to say measure it in like the money that's involved in it. But what if it's an innovation that wasn't monetized at all? Like, one of the reasons why, say, Mark Zuckerberg was well known on campus before he came up with Facebook is that he wrote this fantastic algorithm which recognizes your music taste, which is how come something like Spotify can come up with, say, you like this band, so you might like this band, is that people like Mark Zuckerberg came up with those kind of like early algorithms in the noughties. You can't really measure the economic value of that because he uploaded it online for free. So how do you measure that if there's no money going on? Or say, if you assume that innovation is about making more value in the economy, well, what is value? Because, for example, whoever came up with the idea of using tobacco plants to make cigarettes created an innovation which was worth lots and lots of money, but it also killed people, which net has to be bad. But if you measure it just in, say, the money that it's created, it looks great. It's like there's constantly assumptions that you have to work with and then sort of stress test. It's kind of the point.
Brilliant. Well, I think we've been going for about 40 minutes, so we will call that to a halt on part 1 and join us again in a few minutes for part 2.
In this part of the podcast, we're going to talk to an academic who has previously had a professional career before deciding to return into academia to undertake his doctoral research. Today we have Dr. Ben Jones, who is a teaching fellow in European foreign policy. He has completed a PhD in European studies at King's College with a thesis on military capability cooperation in contemporary Europe. Before that, he worked in various policy and advisory roles between Brussels and London, amongst others as a foreign affairs and defense advisor to the Liberal Democrats in Westminster. Ben, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Pleasure to join you, Thomas.
Great. So let's start with some questions. We would be very keen to know, why did you decide to come back, sort of, if you will, into university after you've had several years of working in other sectors?
Yeah, I guess it comes down to a bit having sort of had a bit of a career as a political staffer, if you like, working with a political party. I've done other things, but that was probably most of what I was doing, working for the Lib Dems in Brussels, at the European Parliament, and then at Westminster. And the thing about those kind of jobs is, well, there's a few things. It helps to be young. It helps not to have a family. I mean, people do juggle them, but yeah, so it helps to be sort of fairly fresh and prepared to. It's not just long hours. It's being, you need to be on site. You need to be with the politicians, with what they're doing at all hours. So it's quite demanding. So that's one reason why you might not want to do it after a certain number of years. But also there's a kind of, you tend to get dropped off a conveyor belt in those jobs. With me, it came with the end of with the creation of the Lib Dem Conservative Coalition, and the way things fell, the Lib Dems didn't have any cabinet posts in my field, sort of foreign affairs and defence. So I kind of fell off the conveyor belt at that point. There wasn't a job. And then if you're a political staffer, you can go down in a few different directions. And one being consultancy, sort of public affairs. And I decided to do that for a while whilst I was thinking. or you could maybe join a political party. Well, if you look at what happened to the Liberal Democrats after 2010, you might see there wasn't a huge amount of options for joining the parliamentary party there. So it's really kind of, if you don't go into trying to be elected, and if you don't go into public affairs, what else can you do? That's what most people do. Anyway, I felt towards the end of my job as a political advisor, I felt that I'd like to, have something that was a bit more of a structured career that would last me a good few years. And I was very fortunate that I was able to kind of dip my toe in the water, so to speak, because I applied to do a visiting fellowship at the EU Institute for Security Studies in Paris. And I kind of got a bit lucky there. I was quite fortunate because I was interested in Franco-British defence cooperation. And by sheer good fortune, the coalition government under David Cameron decided to relaunch that in a big way. And there was a lot of substance there, so-called Lancaster House treaties. So while I was there, I was able to do quite a good, substantial policy paper on that. And I thought, well, that set the sort of foundations for a more role, maybe more as an analyst or maybe even academia. And so I could have gone down that kind of think tank analyst role, maybe. But I really wanted a bit more depth. I wanted a good amount of time to work on something. I wanted the challenge as well. I did actually kind of harbour a desire to do a PhD. I'd nearly been on that track when I came out of my undergraduate. I did a master's, which could have turned into a PhD, but I kind of left that and went off to do work in Brussels, amongst other things. So I just wanted that challenge of looking at something in great depth, which you don't necessarily get in any other career. But I didn't at that point necessarily feel that I would go into academia as a profession. It was really that I wanted that time out to look at a field in real depth. And it happened that I sort of, as I got involved and I did some teaching, and then a position came up at King's, thought, well, no, actually I have been looking for a kind of different career, and I enjoy this. And so, yeah, I've ended up staying on this path.
Were you thinking about PhD beforehand? As in after you finished your studies before that, did you consider that then, or why did you decide sort of to go into professional career first?
Yeah, I mean, I did my undergraduate degree in politics at Sheffield University, and I applied for, at that point, my real interest was political philosophy. So I applied for funding, and I actually got so-called 1+3 funding, so a master's followed by PhD at Cambridge. Right. So I did my master's at Cambridge in history of political thought, but I found it, I don't know, I found myself sort of fearing becoming a dusty old historian. And no offense, that sounds terrible. No offense to the historians out there. But, I was studying sort of Renaissance diplomacy, and it was, I wanted to reconnect with the real world a bit. And the idea of doing that for another 3 years was not appealing. So at that point, I decided to do something professional. So I applied to the, eventually, after a bit of sort of hanging around and doing various things, I applied for internship at the European Commission. And I was successful in that. Initially, that was just supposed to be for 5 months, and I ended up staying in Brussels for 4 years. That's the way these things work. Ended up at the European Parliament. But I guess I'd always, it's not like I just left university and went straight into a career. I kind of nearly went into academia. So I guess at the back of my head, I always had that sense that it was something that not quite unfinished business, but I did have that feeling that I'd like to do a PhD, that it would be something I would like to do, even if I didn't do an academic career afterwards. I felt it was something valuable in its own right. And it kind of, maybe it was just a natural, the way things ended with the political side of things. I wanted to do something else, and I was kind of drawn to that.
And would you say that your experience outside of academia has informed your research? You mentioned that you were working on a policy paper beforehand that was on that topic as well. Would you say that somehow informed maybe your choice of your research and how you approached things later?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. The actual idea to study Franco-British defence cooperation came from work as an advisor to Liberal Democrats. I kind of knew that there were a lot of structural problems in European defence in the UK and elsewhere in terms of this problem of military capability becoming increasingly unaffordable, partly due to defence inflation, partly due to subdued spending. And I wanted to develop that and investigate that more and find out to what degree cooperation might be an answer to this affordability problem. So it definitely came out of my professional experience. I was also fortunate that it meant that I had some good contacts, and I think that meant I could discuss this real world problem with people who weren't academics and who would give me the kind of on the ground practitioner view of things. So I came into academia. I mean, it's funny how things work. I came in to do a PhD wanting to expand my empirical knowledge of a field, but I ended up, maybe this is the old political philosopher coming out in me, I ended up becoming engrossed in theory, and theory and methodology and that kind of thing. So I ended up indulging in that probably more than on the empirical side. Yes, so it's strange the way these things go, It came back from a kind of practitioner perspective, got wrapped up in the world of academia again.
I see. Yeah, it's very interesting to hear that as well from some of our other guests, where you just come to understand that doing research and doing just any academic work, starting from a PhD, is all such a process and so malleable as well that it just takes different turns. So that's really interesting what you're saying here. I think one last final question we would like to hear your answer to is perhaps whom would you recommend such a path? Where do you think one could decide to potentially take some years of a career beforehand?
I don't know. I mean, part of the lesson is that these things are very difficult to plan. They almost happen somehow according to opportunities that arise almost randomly in your life. So I think it's more about where you're at intellectually at any given time, and if you have any doubts that maybe what you're interested in as a PhD, you could get under the skin of it more effectively in the professional world for a while. You could become the practitioner in the field you're interested in. You would then enter your PhD with a very different mindset, I think, from those who enter it, undergraduate, masters, and then PhD. Not to disparage that at all, because there's a lot of very fine academics who take that path. But if you're the kind of person who likes to kind of get a hands-on perspective, then maybe going out into the world of the practitioners first is a good idea.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of answer that I thought you would also give, because obviously, as you've just told me, it's not like you were planning from the beginning to do these things. But that was a really interesting talk, Ben. Thank you very much for being on our podcast. And now we're off to the second part. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back everyone for part 2 of the Call My Supervisor podcast. In the first half, we looked at Bill's research, and in this second half, we're going to be looking more at his PhD experience, getting his insights, and picking up a few words of advice. Over to you, Tomek.
So Bill, Would you tell us how you're finding the experience of the PhD? How is it different from your expectations?
Like any kind of love, it's sort of it's complicated. I really enjoy a lot of the processes, but as with any job, it's sort of like you take the rough with the smooth. Like, for example, as I was alluding to earlier, especially with academic research, there's lost time, there's lost resources. You might have this amazing idea one day, work on it for 2 weeks and go, nope, that's never going to happen, which is frustrating. You can sink a lot of time and effort into stuff that doesn't work out, and you kind of have to check back on yourself to sort of think, how will I know when this is working? Because losing that time and that effort is like a big thing to lose. I really love the opportunity to like explore the way stuff works. I really love being able to carve out time to read these pieces that people have put a lot of themselves into, and be able to decide what they're getting wrong, what they're getting right, what evidence they're using, where they're going wrong, that kind of thing. I really love that opportunity. And also I really love building the skills that you build along the way. Like I was saying this to someone a little while back, but it feels a little bit like having this secret power that, like, if you do this kind of work, that you can learn to understand when someone makes this argument, what techniques they're using, what evidence they're using, and how they come together, and the way in which arguments can be presented in a certain way, but when you look into the nuts and bolts of exactly how they're constructed, it's not quite how it's presented. And that's really cool, being able to properly unpick exactly when people say certain things and they allude to certain evidence, that actually they're trying to make their evidence look way better than it is. That even in tiny little words and phrases, they can make a certain piece of evidence look way more persuasive than it actually is. And that's really amazing, being able to do that. But yeah, as I say, I really love doing it, and I love a lot of the skills that come with it. I love getting the opportunity to properly look at a problem and understand it, but that comes with its own problems. And yeah, it's the kind of thing that you need to be able to properly decompress sometimes. That sometimes it can be really frustrating, but a lot of the time it can be really rewarding.
I also thought you alluded quite a lot about this feeling like a job in many respects, which of course it understandably is with the amount of time you're spending on the research. I was wondering, did you think about going into research not in academia? And if you did, why did you choose to do a PhD instead?
So I thought about it, and at the end of the day, it's always a possibility. In a lot of ways, why I opted to do a PhD is because it felt as though it was the thing that kept the most doors that I was interested in going through open,
right,
whilst opening as many new ones as possible without closing any. Because I really like the sort of field that I'm in, of looking at economic phenomena and understanding how they work, and trying to find the best ways of sort of managing certain phenomena like that. And getting this PhD gives me more opportunity to do more of that work in the positions where I'm most able to have influence. But it doesn't especially close off any routes. Like, it's a big commitment, and at the end of the day, there's always a trade-off. But I always felt as though doing this meant that I had more chances to do the kind of things that I wanted to do, not less. So I thought about it, and I'm still thinking about it. I might very well do that. In a lot of ways, doing academic research, as much as it has its downsides, what attracts me to academic research is more about the autonomy that you have as an academic, rather than being part of a larger machine. So if you do research for big think tanks like, say, Chatham House, or a big one at the moment is the RAND Corporation. They have the kind of resources and the kind of access and information that you might not get as an individual academic working by yourself. And having that kind of information is the real lifeblood of research, because you can be excellent at interpreting results and giving your specific analysis of something, and you can be excellent at that. But at the end of the day, you're only cooking with what you've got. And a lot of it is not just being able to make the best meal with what you've got. It's about getting the ingredients. So the great thing about private research is you can oftentimes get way better information that you can do stuff with. But what you sacrifice there is getting to choose exactly what you want to do, because a private research institute is a company, it's a business. It does research for an end. Whereas in academia, there's less of an incentive to have something, have a result. You've always got to bear a purpose in mind, but if you do it as an academic by yourself, you get a lot more choice. And I really like that. I think being able to choose exactly what I look into, that's something that I value quite a lot.
But has there been something that you found especially useful, or that you've come to rely on, or that has been, a source of relief or comfort to you during the process? Has Chat GPT solved all your problems?
I think you brought up AI like ChatGPT. I've used things like that for some tasks, and they can be good, but they'll never be able to do your thinking for you, if you get what I mean. It can give you certain perspectives, which can be interesting. It can give you certain information, but it's never quite perfect. It's one of those things where, unless you're doing something relatively simple, you've got to know enough about the thing to know when it's wrong, at which point you may as well have done it yourself. Those kind of things can be helpful, but only really for the simpler stuff. I think what's oftentimes more helpful is individual softwares and things like, say, some people use, say, data analysis software. I'm not as big on that, but say, for example, in the statistical program that I use, Stata, it has an absolutely fantastic system, which is it's called the web use command, which is, instead of doing what I did when I did my master's thesis, which was using like a relatively big data set to make sort of linear regressions and things, what I did when I did that, because I wasn't aware that you could do this, was I made this huge database and I individually typed in different numbers for the metrics. So like each individual GDP amount for each year. It took about 2 weeks to make that database, just me on a laptop typing in the numbers to make a massive spreadsheet. Really slow. What you can do now is that you can link it to a specific database and it will automatically fill the entire thing, which saves a whole lot of time. So something like that. But then also, one thing that I like is just taking a lot of time to look into exactly how I'm making things happen and how I can make that quicker. So like time management, I think is a really helpful thing. So I have a spreadsheet on my laptop which sort of shows the way in which I'm planning to spend my time, and then I can sort of review that and say, that thing that I'm working on, that's not really coming to much. Maybe I shouldn't commit so much of my time on that. That's definitely like a really useful thing that I can properly, unremittingly look at how I'm spending my time and going, is that bring the project forward the most? That is definitely, that is a bit, that's not helping at all. That might not come to anything, that kind of thing. But also having big documents just to keep all of my notes in the right place, that kind of thing. When you're working with this big of a project, a lot of it is all about keeping the individual moving parts organized, because otherwise you're wasting so much time in just understanding what you've done and where it is and all of that kind of stuff. I think that's way more important than a lot of the sort of glitzier stuff that you might think would be what brings a project forward. So much of it, like with any job, is keeping stuff organized, knowing where stuff is, understanding what work you're doing and how useful that work is. I think those are the most important things from my perspective.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of organization that has to go into the research, which, as you're saying, will save you time now and will save you time in the future, hopefully, as well. I was wondering, what are some of the biggest challenges that you've been facing in your research?
I spoke about this earlier a bit, but one of the biggest challenges is there's always going to be a disconnect between what information you want to be working with and what you can be. Because even if you have like this vast quantity of resources to, say, fly over here and talk to this person, or send out huge numbers of surveys and get people to come back to you, you're never going to get all of the stuff that you need to do your research. And being able to reconcile the distance between what's possible and what's practicable, I think that's a big challenge. I think a lot of the time it's about just acceptance and being able to work with what you've got. I think that's a part of it. But also, I think the biggest thing is stamina. It's being able to not just stay motivated, but just stay interested. I think for anyone, it would be a really big challenge to work on a project this long and still want to do it, because it's a really big commitment of your time and all of those resources. So that's part of it. Yeah, it's a big commitment of your time and your resources, but I think again it's worth it in the long run if you're really interested in the project. Yeah, I think it's about stamina. It's about understanding the difference between what's possible and what's ideal. Yeah.
So for the people listening to this who would perhaps be considering taking on a PhD, whether they're at undergrad level or master's level, or perhaps they've been in the professional world and are thinking about, going back into academia, what would your advice be for someone considering a PhD? Maybe it's a singular piece, maybe there's a couple of reflections you've got.
I think it would be very easy to sort of say doing a doctorate is really fun. Everyone should do it. It's very fulfilling, and it's a good sort of investment of your time, which I think is true, but I don't think it's for everyone. And a lot of the time, it's more about what are you doing it for at the end of the day. And for example, from my perspective, I feel as though a career in academia is something I'm really attracted to, but also there are other things that I can do with a PhD that make it worth it. And I think it depends what you want out of it, in essence. I think if it's as simple as I really want to be, say, a lecturer. I've wanted to be a lecturer for forever, and this is how I do it. Yeah, I can see that that's worthwhile. But then what about the specific projects? What about staying interested in the same specific project? Or what about which university to do it at? Different universities do things differently. They prioritize different things. And then there's which specific supervisor should I work with? Like, for example, I know someone who worked with a supervisor for a very long time, and increasingly it became clear they actually had the complete opposite opinion about the thesis at hand. And one person was just like, this explains this completely. And the other person was like, hang on, I completely disagree with you. How did we not realize that? It's a difficult thing to just say, yes, you should do this thing. It can be an incredibly rewarding thing, but it's a really, really big commitment. And it's the kind of thing where you can go a long way with it before you realize that it wasn't the right thing. So I think in the abstract, it's a really good thing to do, but you've got to bear in mind lots of different things. And also that at the end of the day, if it's just a doctorate to try and get a job in academia, that academia changes quite a lot. And if you're just doing a PhD just to go into academia. It's a very big commitment for something that is a very sort of complex and often changeable market for lecturers. But like, I would definitely recommend it in general, and I think it can be something that can be really rewarding. But it's the kind of thing that you really need to think very, very hard about before you do it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. And I'll just pick up on a point you were mentioning earlier about the PhD community. How much of a help is that? Is it a help in generating ideas and support? Is it easy to plug into? What's that like?
I definitely really appreciate the opportunity among the PhD community at King's to be able to sort of bounce ideas around and things like that. But finding the right person to bounce ideas off can be quite difficult, because as you go through academia, progressively over time, in general, you specialize more and more and more. So we have a postgrad office where a lot of PhD students can work together, but a lot of the time someone who's sitting next to you does something completely different to you, and so you don't always have the same frames of reference to properly understand things. So the good thing is that a lot of the time, if you're doing, say, a social science project, a lot of the foundations that you're basing your research on are going to be the same. So if you find, say, any social science researcher at King's, they probably, say, very familiar with, say, the work of Marx or John Locke or Rousseau or someone like that, and that can be kind of like a good reference point to talk about the fundamentals of your research, where, say, for example, they might not understand that you're looking at this very specific interpretation of this phenomenon, but they probably would understand if you framed it as, I'm looking at questions of equality or liberty, and I'm looking at these approaches to looking at this thing. So it can be difficult to find the right person to talk through your problem with, but a lot of the time there's someone who can see the problem in the abstract, but from a different perspective. But being able to bounce ideas off of people in the department, that's really good.
Good stuff. Okay, well, that about brings an end to this very first episode of Call My Supervisor. My thanks to Tomek for your contribution today.
Thank you.
And of course, thank you to Bill Weston, our first PhD victim of the series. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone, and we'll join you again soon.